Welcome to the third in our series on crossing borders, the third of four on routes of migrations. Then there will be a break for most of March, and then we'll return for four more on making lives and communities in the United States. I will quickly welcome you. I'm John Tutino, and I am the director of the Americas Forum. I will note that the series is co-sponsored by the Forum and the new Georgetown Americas Institute. We'll emphasize that we will be recorded. I don't quite see the recording button on, but it will, I bet, be on soon. And that the recording will be up on the Americas Institute website in about a week for anyone who would like to consult it there. Beyond that, for the moment, I want to thank the organizers and report that, unfortunately, today's moderator, Alejandro Werner, who I expected to introduce as the soon to be, in March, he will come on as the founding director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. And he has a long career in the policy world related to these and other issues. He faced an unfortunate emergency and could not be with us this afternoon. So I invited Marcella Harden. She is formally the program coordinator for the Americas Forum, but more importantly, she has meaningful time with hands-on experience helping migrants face the challenges of their lives. She is charging through a doctoral program here, focusing on migrant challenges from Mexico, from Central America through Mexico to the United States. And so I will step back, since I have another role primarily today, and pass the mic to Marcella.
Yes, hello everybody, and welcome to tonight's talk. I just wanted to let you all know a little bit about how it's going to work. We're going to go ahead and have our presentation with Professor John Tutino, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers in the later part of the talk. So if you have a question, go ahead and you can put it in the Q&A, and we will get to those later on. So yeah, I see some of my colleagues and friends in the audience tonight, so I'm hoping that we'll have some great questions and conversations. But yeah, so tonight's talk, The Big Push, Medical Miracles, Green Revolutions, and the Roots of Migration, will be given by Professor John Tutino. Professor John Tutino is a professor of history and international affairs, and of course, the director of the Georgetown Americas Forum. He studies the long-term history of Mexican communities in the context of global capitalism. And he has written and co-edited several books, but the works most pertinent to this current conversation include The Mexican Heartland, How Communities Made Capitalism, a Nation and World History, 1500 to 2000, which was published by Princeton in 2018, and two edited volumes, Mexico and Mexicans in the Making of the United States, which was published in 2012, and New World Cities, Challenges of Urbanization and Globalization in the Americas, published in 2019. Professor Tutino's work aims to integrate studies of the environment, production, and state power with an emphasis on labor, ethnic, and gender relations, which we will hear a little bit more about in this talk. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to John Tutino.
And I will say thank you, Marcella, and particularly thank you for being ready and able to jump in on pretty short notice. So much appreciated. Okay, I want to begin by emphasizing that men and women have been leaving Mexico in search of work and new lives since the late 19th century. And their numbers rapidly have accelerated since about 1950. Migrants have come in growing numbers from Central America since the 1970s. And the stories for leaving, struggles in crossing, laborious lives of arrival, and new communities that they've created are endlessly varied, as we've seen in the last couple of talks and in many more to come. Those stories are as varied as the diverse cultures and struggles for survival in very different regions of Mexico and Central America, where people faced changing challenges through the 20th century and into the 21st. So essentially, 7 of the 8 presentations in this series, rightly, I'm going to say, focus on diversity, different problems, different challenges, different places. But I'm here today to raise a different perspective, that behind the endlessly different challenges, travails, and opportunities, there lurk fundamental shared transformations that are essential to understand the rising tides of migration that have shaped so many lives and societies in the late 20th century and into the 21st. Ultimately, the forces underlying migrations, I want to argue, are ecological in the macro sense. They are rooted in changing relations between human populations, the earth we all depend upon for survival, and the ways that majorities work to survive, while smaller numbers aim to rule and gain some profit. That big perspective emphasized, I'm going to begin with a brief overview in the ways migrations have shaped the Americas since Europeans arrived in growing numbers from the early 16th century. But having said that, it's also important to emphasize Europeans were the least numerous of migrants early on. Their first and most decisive impact on the ecology of the Americas was to introduce, absolutely unwittingly, grounded in thorough ignorance, a series of diseases: smallpox, plague, typhus, more. Not understood by Europeans, but part of their everyday lives, and absolutely unknown in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. In the century that followed, a depopulation of 80 to 90% devastated native peoples and radically shifted the ecology of the hemisphere. Suddenly, resources were plentiful while people were scarce. And I will say, were that the only consequence? The survivors might, he said might, have gained ample access to land and other resources to carry on. And I'll emphasize, that would have in no way been compensation for the unfathomable losses of kin and community, but at least a minimal compensation, one might say. But then around 1550, as people vanished and resources opened, the world changed. China turned to a silver standard that made Spanish American silver suddenly valuable and exceptionally profitable. At the same time, European demand for sugar rose to make profit possible in unprecedented ways along Atlantic lowlands. The challenge everywhere, however, was clear and to at least a degree shared. In times of continuing depopulation, who would work? And the first answer to the question has to be underlined: almost never Europeans. They were not going to do the work that generated these new economic openings. 3 patterns did emerge. 2 of them built on migrations, and very different migrations The first, minimally migratory. In the Andean highlands and in the Mesoamerican regions that range from around the city of Mexico, south through Guatemala, surviving native peoples had been so numerous before that even having disappeared by 70, 80, 90%, they remained numerous enough that they were recongregated into landed, self-governing communities. And as such, they served as the foundations for globally important silver economies from the late 16th century through the 18th century. Thus, they're not a primary focus here, though they're a focus of much of my interest elsewhere. Along Atlantic coasts, first in Brazil, but then driving north through the Caribbean into the Chesapeake. Coerced migrations, both words matter. Coerced migrations delivered enslaved Africans to labor at the foundation of plantation economies. And to emphasize something that is not always emphasized, after 1800, coerced migrations continued, both across the Atlantic to supply Cuba and Brazil, but they continued within the United States to force migrations of enslaved peoples from the Chesapeake in particular, to a degree from the coastal Carolinas, to move across the US South to reach eventually Louisiana and beyond, to live as bound hands making cotton. So I want to emphasize that the first, and actually the most enduring of the great migrations to the Americas, endures from the mid-16th century to the mid-19th century, and forced Africans to build and sustain plantation economies and profits. The third original adaptation to depopulation led to a different foundational migration, one that is little known, but yet in fact is pivotal to the world we face today. Beginning in the Bahia Basin, a world Marcela knows is dear to my heart. It's about 100 miles north of Mexico City. Population had been sparse before 1500. Cultivators, hunters, and gatherers lived there, but rarely in settled towns, never subject to state powers. When silver was found at Guanajuato and Zacatecas, and regions now north central and northern Mexico, Europeans and Mesoamericans, indigenous peoples, flooded north, bringing diseases and provoking wars that all but vacated the fertile lands of the Bahia and the arid country reaching north. The result, to make the Bahia and northern New Spain, now northern Mexico, into a silver economy, mine operators drew men from Mesoamerica northward to take on often deadly, regularly maiming labor with offers of ore shares. Today we'd call it profit sharing, and wages 4 times higher than those anywhere else in the Americas. Okay, a quick aside. Why not just drag in African slaves? African slaves are property, too costly and too valuable to risk in the deadly underground work of mining. So they almost never went there, though they did work, as we'll see, in support activities there. To build an agricultural foundation to sustain silver mines and new cities, Spaniards claimed the land and offered secure salaries, not as high as the mine workers, but solid, secure salaries, maize rations, thus guaranteed sustenance, and also access to small family plots to draw more numerous families from indigenous communities to the south into the region. They often came from around Mexico City or around Pátzcuaro, to work the land. And at the same time, in smaller numbers, but not unimportant, to open textile workshops at Querétaro to supply local and mining and northern needs. The founders drew workers north again with ample wages and guaranteed food rations. The foundations of the region I have come to call Spanish North America, because it began in the Bahia and in time reached to Texas and California, was built on continuing migrations, mostly from Mesoamerica northward. And we have at least a pretty accurate cross-section of the composition of that migration. We know that Africans, sadly, were near 100% of those forced to migrate as slaves. In this northward migration, no more than 2% came from Europe. Perhaps 20% at most, 15 to 20 seems the range, were bound out of Africa. The rest, at least 80% of the migrant population, mixed diverse Mesoamericans. Mexica, Otomi, people then called Tarascans, now preferably Purépechas. They came northward and mixed together through the 18th century. And as I said, the mixing included Africans too. Africans were overwhelmingly male, and Spanish law said children followed the status of their mothers. So Africans came and merged with the large indigenous population to produce growing numbers of mixed free people. They went north together, and they were the early populations of Texas and California under Spanish rule through to the end of the 18th century. All right. So there are foundations in migration across the Americas. The depopulation that underlay both migrations slowed after 1600. Population stayed scarce through the 1600s. And by around 1700, populations began to rise again across the hemisphere. Different rates, different regions. But that growth continued through the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th. And what I want to say is, in contested history, is way too complex to engage here. The trades in bound Africans finally ended. Internationally, around 1850. Within the US, in 1860, at the outbreak of the Civil War. Meanwhile, as that migration ended, that forced migration, a second great migration accelerated with limited coercions. A mix of population growth, urbanization, industrialization opened new routes to profit in Europe, but left many to struggle on the land. You'll hear some reflections of that later on in the Americas. At the same time, new cities and industries in the New World promised opportunities, and so did lands being cleared of native peoples in the interiors of both North and South America. People struggling in the face of displacements in Europe came in rising numbers, often mixing circular flows of labor in return for a while, but while in time, settlements created new communities of immigrants. And what is in a way a transatlantic precedent to what we see in the 20th century in the Americas. So I want to conclude this introductory overview by saying the first great migration bound Africans to come to labor in the Americas. The second great migration incentivized Europeans to migrate and then to face restrictions over time. Then in the 20th century, what we may sooner or later decide to call the Third Great Migration. Historic flows from Mesoamerica, from Mexico and Central America, revived to accelerate with ebbs and flows before 1950, and then they surged after 1950. And again, early on, there were modest incentives, but very quickly in the post-1950 surge, the US turned to controls, constraints, and prohibitions. The acceleration of migration within the hemisphere demands explanation before we can understand the turn to constraints and their limited successes. The turn to constraints, the limited successes, focuses so many policy conversations today. We need to understand what lies behind them. Again, I want to emphasize, first half of the 20th century, the long ecological cycle that began with the 16th century depopulation and then evolved through centuries of slow repopulation came to a new juncture. The Andean and Mesoamerican regions that were densely populated in 1500, finally, between the 1920s and 1950, reattained their pre-contact population. They returned to where they had been before the old world diseases came. The once sparsely populated Atlantic coasts and interior zones, all but emptied after contact, reached densities that ended forced migrations in the mid-19th century and made incentives to voluntary migration less common, and in time led to restrictions. To outline the regions that focus our conversations today, Mesoamerica and the US, the population of Mexico reached about 20 million as it approached 1950. And that is pretty close to the level that's been documented for 1500. The United States had reached about 100 million by 1920. And in that context, the US concluded that it should restrict most immigration in 1924, except arrivals from Mexico. An interesting parallel conversation. In that context, steady flows came north from 1900 to 1950, from Mexico to the United States, many to labor, others to make families. There were pressures to return that struck US-born citizens during the Depression years of the 1930s. Then World War II stimulated revivals negotiated in the famous Bracero Pacts, in which the US government joined the Mexican government to organize, orchestrate, and partially legalize, but not fully legalize, return migrations north. All right. Simply said, everything changed around 1950. Unprecedented population explosions transformed basic ecologies. People began to concentrate in surging cities. Unimagined ways of production developed to feed people in cities and in time everywhere. And in time, unprecedented global and continental integrations fused economies, linked societies, opened cultures, while national polities and borders remained hard. And it's the mix of, shall we say, exploding populations, the integration of almost everything, but the retention of hard national polities and borders set the world for the challenges it faces today. It is a world ecologically radically different from the centuries before. And it has generated migration challenges that impact uncountable lives and focus what have become endless policy debates. Again, some just basic numbers illustrate. The population explosion that began in the 1950s is well understood, but I want to say radically underappreciated. In 1950, the world sustained about 2.5 billion people. We are now on the verge of reaching 8 billion people. The total number of humans the world needs to sustain has more than tripled in 70 years. The US population grew from near 160 million to 320 million, merely doubling. And you start to see a trend. The more prosperous regions of the world experience population growth, but at lesser rates. Mexico soared from near 25 million to pass 130 million in the same 70 years, rising 5 times. And Guatemala, the most populous of the Central American countries, rose from 3.5 million to 18 million, also 5 times in the same period. To put it another way, in 1950, the combined populations of Mexico and Guatemala were 1/5 the population of the US. Today, they're nearly half. We could almost stop there and simply understand why migrants have been driving northward. But actually, if we want to find ways to make lives more sustainable and more humane, and I desperately want to believe we all do, then we have to understand the complex, contradictory processes that drove unprecedented transformations and migrations. And what I want to emphasize, by the way, the title to this was not tongue-in-cheek. It's serious. It all began in pursuits of the good and some real achievements of good. And it needs to be understood. During World War II, British and US mostly pharmaceutical companies perfected penicillin and other antibiotics. The goal then was to save soldiers in the field. Worked pretty well. After the war, they sought markets for new wonder drugs, as they were known. They made them widely available across the world. Places like the US with a formal medical system, you probably needed to get a prescription and go to the pharmacy with it. Places like Mexico and Central America, they were just in the pharmacies. The pharmacist, you told the pharmacist, he gave it to you, and it worked. Here, a personal note is necessary. I am only here able to give this talk because as a 4-year-old in 1951, a 2-week course of penicillin saved my life in a hospital in Massachusetts without the wonder drug. So I appreciate them. I will never say bad of penicillin at all. Across Mexico and Central America, families that historically had 5 to 6 children in the hope that 2 or 3 would live to contribute to a family economy and sustain their parents in their old age, right? Now, for the first time ever, a generation saw nearly all survive. Pharmaceutical companies profited and gained praise. Parents saw healthy children live and grow up to be adults. And again, no tongue in cheek, a great good for capitalism and families too, together. The immediate challenge, how to feed the growing numbers. There too, capitalism had an answer. The United States had developed a new mechanized agriculture using hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. Brilliantly adapted to a nation with vast lands and limited rural populations. Mexico, it needs to be emphasized, had actually turned to that new solution before the 1950s population surge. In a famous image, at the 1940s inauguration of Lázaro Cárdenas' successor, and I cite him because he's well known and his successor isn't, and he was probably behind the policy too. Standing on the podium next to Mexico's great post-revolutionary reformer, the man who had overseen implementation of Mexico's great land reform, were US Vice President Henry Wallace and Nelson Rockefeller. Wallace's family owned Pioneer Seeds, one of the great manufacturers of the new hybrid seeds. Rockefeller's family foundation was ready to fund a new agriculture for Mexico, adopting the new systems to Mexico. And it's important to know that the first efforts focused on adapting hybrid wheat to Mexico. Well, sure, unless you think for a moment. Mexico's millions by 1940 of land reform recipients adamantly focused on raising maize and to feeding their families first, while sending limited surpluses to the cities. The explicit goal in 1940 was to raise enough wheat to feed the cities. Rural Mexicans would get their tortillas, urban Mexicans would have to live with bolillos. Mexicans will get the joke. And by the end of the decade, it was working. Mexico was moving toward a dual agricultural system in which family production for sustenance would sustain a majority still overwhelmingly rural. Green Revolution, as it came to be known, production, would and did feed cities and make profit. And this is a little tongue-in-cheek, arguably a fair and balanced game. Then the population explosion came. Growing numbers surged far beyond the availability of land for family sustenance, family production. In the attempt, overcropping brought destructive erosions. So the government turned the Green Revolution to maize, the historic sustenance of the Mesoamerican peoples. And again, soaring harvest kept a soaring population alive. Arguably an essential good. But it didn't turn out to be an unmitigated good. It came with contradictions that shaped the world, because the world adopted Mexico's Green Revolution pretty quickly. Soaring harvest came by employing machines, industrial seeds, which meant you couldn't even plant last year's crop for this year's. You had to buy seeds. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. It used all that. It used everything but people. It did not employ humans. People could eat while they faced ever greater challenges to finding a way to sustain life beyond barest survival. The ultimate contradiction of the Green Revolution. It was a triumph in attaining ways to sustain life while making growing numbers of lives impossible. And that contradiction is what lies at the foundation of migrant flows from Mexico and Central America since 1950. Having done the generality, I need to emphasize there were important regional differences between how this impacted Mexico and Central America. In Mexico, the Green Revolution came in a society seeking national development. Across Central America, parallel green revolutions came to nations seeking export development. Mexico's green revolution spread around the world. Central America's was copied too, in ways less noted. To do a quick comparison, after the land reform of the 1920s and the 1930s, as I said, cultivation focused on family production. When population growth after 1950 made that ever less possible, many families with a little government support tried to adapt the Green Revolution to shrinking family plots. The costs of the inputs made it near impossible. The resulting erosions, because these are often hilly lands, made it unsustainable. It's at that point that growing numbers turned to circular, seasonal migrations across Mexico and across borders into the US, while others turned to migrate to Mexican cities. Demand for commercial sustenance rose, while secure lives of work and access to sustenance held scarce in the cities too. As people flowed to Mexican cities, those cities were industrializing, but they too turned to labor saving, the euphemism calls it, ways of production in order to remain competitive. Again, some basic numbers are interesting. And it's pretty clear that the first wave of migration pressed by the Green Revolution went to Mexico City and other Mexican cities. Mexico City's metropolitan population jumped from 3 to 15 million from 1910 to 1990. While the Mexican-born population in the US rose from just under 500,000 to nearly 4.5 million. They're both substantial increases. And we're pretty confident that the Mexican origin population in the United States was at least twice that. Shall we say the US Census figures don't make those totals easy to come by? And we'll leave it there for the moment. But in the shadow of the Green Revolution, migrations out of rural Mexico to Mexican cities and Mexican America surged together. Meanwhile, in Central America, parallel impacts of the Green Revolution in expanding export economies led first to violent revolutionary conflicts, and then to accelerating migrations north. The mix of population growth, land concentrations, and what I call technochemical innovations that drove Salvadoran migrants to Honduras in the 1960s and 1970s. It's all well documented, as is the Honduran facing land invasions, land shortages. The Honduran government decided to expel Salvadoran immigrants. And the result was the brief, deadly, disruptive, and now all but forgotten soccer war of 1969, horridly misnamed because it began as a spat in a soccer stadium at a match between Honduras and El Salvador. It was not about the soccer match. It was about Salvadoran migration, people expelled by transformations in the agricultural world, and then the Hondurans' reverse expulsion. Also, exceptionally well documented are the Green Revolution innovations that transformed export production across Central America, radically in sugar, cotton, and livestock grazing, to lesser degrees in coffee and bananas. Sugar, we know. I love to semi-cynically comment that the cotton transformation was the radical expansion of grazing on lands to produce cheap, low-quality beef so that we in the United States could consume McDonald's and other fast food hamburgers. And in the process, driving humans off the land. At the same time, a radical expansion of cotton production for export was stimulated by your and my demand for blue jeans. And if you want to focus on El Salvador was both the source of much cotton and the historic source of the indigo dye that gave you blue jeans. So again, if you eat fast food, wear blue jeans, or if your folks did, there's some link to the origins of the revolutions in Central America. It struck coffee and bananas, older and established exports with different land uses, less. But what has been shown is that those dislocations drove humans off the land across the isthmus in times of radical population growth. And those dislocations led to popular mobilizations within, demanding access to land, rights, food, etc., that mobilized repressive reactions from established regimes, often backed, funded, and armed by the United States, that shaped the revolutions in Central America in the 1980s. Deadly conflicts racked the region, yes, most deadly in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And they left the powers backed by the US in power everywhere but Nicaragua. I want to emphasize that the technochemical ways of production carried on everywhere, including Nicaragua. So what we see in Central America is that the dislocations of revolution and repression built upon dislocations of production, where that production was more oriented to export profit than local sustenance originally. But the result is, during and after those revolutions, rising waves of migration came north. And of course, those of us in Washington, D.C. are well aware, D.C. became one of the few places where Salvadoran arrivals far outpace and continue to outpace Mexican arrivals, though everybody is here to some degree. So while Central Americans lived revolutions and repressions, Mexico faced what came to be known as the lost decade of the 1980s. Again, too complex to do in great detail, but a debt-financed oil boom in the late 1970s, promoted by the US and its banks in order to bring down global oil prices in the face of OPEC restrictions, brought Mexico a boom in the 1970s that crashed when it succeeded. Mexican oil joined North Sea oil and broke global prices as the 80s began. Prices collapsed, and Mexico faced unsustainable debts. Its economy faced industrial collapse as population growth continued and agriculture became less and less viable as a route to family sustenance. Amid Mexico's crisis, the US passed the Immigration Act of 1986. Complicated, but essentially it aimed for two things. It gave undocumented US immigrant residents routes to remain within certain restrictions, while aiming to curtail continuing arrivals. The plan was, okay, those of you who are here can stay, nobody else come, please. In times of desperation in both Mexico and Central America, we should not be surprised to learn that rights to remain in the US were welcomed by many and taken up by as many as possible, while attempts to curtail migration found very little success. Very little. Simultaneously, and what I will politely call political maneuvers, too complex to engage here, Mexico's regime turned to breaking unions and thus cutting remunerations in the industries that remained, and undermining the rights to family lands that had been gained in post-revolutionary Mexico. All that as preludes to proposing and negotiating NAFTA. The pact was finished in 93. I showed up at Georgetown in DC, so I was here just in time for the last congressional debates and votes. And the pact was inaugurated on January 1, 1994. It aimed to lock in a new model of globalization for Mexico and North America. Again, to simplify what I know is more complex, but pretty clearly, capital and production, commodities and trade would and could cross borders at will. People were to stay home. Unstated but clear to any who would see, Mexico would become a reservoir of cheap labor, while capital and production would flow to take the most profitable advantage wherever they could. The early results were not promising. On January 1, 94, the day of its inauguration, the Zapatistas rose up in Chiapas. And those in power in Mexico and the US feigned surprise. They actually knew it was coming. What followed was a year of violent political transition in Mexico, assassinations and worse. And then, right after the inauguration of the new president, the collapse of the peso. In the longer run, those first problems were surmounted in a year or two. In the long run, Mexican industries focused on internal markets struggled and in time lost strength. While global companies came to Mexico to employ cheap hands, men in auto plants and other heavy industries, women in electronic assembly plants at often very low wages, not very good conditions along the border. Mexican cultivation turned even more to what I euphemize as designer fruits and vegetables. The things you and I expect to see in the grocery store every day. The result is that labor became less well remunerated and scarce in full-time efforts in Mexico, and ever more seasonal in agriculture when available at all. Meanwhile, Mexican cities continued to grow rapidly, and what I call marginality spread across barrios of informality. They actually often opened new, if uncertain and often insecure, chances for women, often constraining the work available to men. And that intersection has something to do with the plague of gender violence that rose across Mexico and continues. Meanwhile, migration from Mexico rose to hold high from 94 to the crash of 2008, 2009. It's actually, at least as documented, the historic peak. We're never certain of the recorded numbers. Since then, Mexican migration has slowed, even with some trends to returns. But we can illustrate, again, with just some basic numbers. So Mexico's population now approaches 130 million. Metropolitan Mexico City approaches 25 million. The people of Mexican origins in the US exceed 40 million. Nearly a quarter of all Mexicans, if we define Mexicans inclusively, live in the United States today. Meanwhile, Central American migration has held strong, in recent times risen, certainly claims growing attention in the US, and by many accounts now surpasses the numbers coming from Mexico to the US. I am not going to try to explain the debates and uncertainties of the last decade. No historian wants to try to keep his credentials and explain the last 10 years. And besides, I've got plenty of colleagues who are going to talk about that in this series. But I want to emphasize, in conclusion, that while we have endless discussions and debates about border policies, regime roles, responsibilities, political interests, and power seekers' corruption, about migrant struggles and evasions, and the like, and I'm going to say again, all of those questions and concerns matters. They're not unimportant, certainly not irrelevant. But none of those conversations will lead to either border solutions, fairness to migrants, or viable, sustainable lives, unless and until we address the underlying structural, and by that I mean ecological, realities that drive and continue to drive migrations. And in those conversations, we have to recognize that while policymakers may design elements, pieces of our changing political economy, the larger challenges have come out of unplanned intersections of demographics, of urbanization, and globalization. The great triumph of making children healthy led to real success sustaining food supplies, while the means of making that food came with real, enduring limits on families' access to sustaining work, to sustenance. Let me emphasize, we have opened important continuing conversations and debates about the challenges of sustaining the earth, which is essential to sustain us all. My argument is that we need to open parallel and equally urgent conversations about the need to sustain viable, secure, and just lives for people. In a world capable of producing endless plenty, yet providing too little to too many, the contradiction is enduring and daunting. And I'm going to emphasize at the end, I sit here with no conclusion, no solution. It's not okay, this is what we need to do. But I am confident we will never gain meaningful improvements unless we take on the difficult, often contradictory conversations about how the triumphs that made and sustain our globalizing world also generated its gravest challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. I'm going to go ahead and start us off with a couple questions here. And just a reminder to the audience, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A and we'll read them out. But just to begin, you gave us some really great data on population growth and how huge of a difference it was, kind of culminating in the 1950s. But I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more description about what that looked like on the ground in the communities that you study in the heartland.
What one sees, and it's not the places I've studied in the heartland, but it has been well studied in many regions. Families, and here I can put a little more detail in. One generation of families from the 50s through into the 60s suddenly saw 5 and 6 children live. They, in fact, quickly started having fewer children. People who somehow say, oh, they couldn't, once they knew their children were going to live, then the next generation went down to 3 to 4, the next generation down to 2, 3 children. But the numbers needing land, if you stayed on the land, had already more than doubled. And the generation that had 2 to 3 kids was twice the size of the generation that had 5 to 6 kids. And this is everywhere, rural and urban. So more numbers need to be sustained. What happens in the community? If you're lucky, you have some land and you give pieces of it to multiple kids, while you hope one, probably a daughter, goes to work as a maid in the city. Those of you who saw Roma saw a piece of that. Others, many a son, before they got their piece of land, went to circular migration in the US and hoped maybe they could buy a pickup truck and do something. But in the end, they didn't have enough land. And they would try to buy, but the government would give them hybrid seeds and fertilizers to raise tomatoes to sell in the city. That's not what these people wanted. So they would take the seeds and plant a few tomatoes, but take the fertilizer and use it on their corn in hopes they would get by the erosion in the small plots. The problem is the wrong fertilizer, the wrong plot. It became sadly dysfunctional, is what you will say. And you get in the heartland, I mean, the transformation is amazing. The regions of the basins around Mexico City were 15%, maybe 20% rural in 1940. They are 85% urban. And the city has landed on the countryside. So in fact, much of the cultivating land is no longer available to cultivate now, as things have gone urban. And you go to the cities and people have found ways to survive, but they're not secure ways, they're not sustainable ways. And they're ways that have provoked a lot of conflict within families and more.
So I had another question about this statement you made about, you claimed that the macro force was ecological in sense. And I mean, in migration debates, there's a lot of conversation around push and pull factors, right?
Yes.
And so the way that I saw your talk, kind of what it was arguing in a sense is that it's the ecological, but it's also labor, right? Because when you talked about these 3 main migrations, they were all labor oriented. So I was wondering if you could talk about how those 2 things are linked.
Sure. Too often ecology is thought of as the state of the geo-environment. And my view, and many others, and I'd like to call down, I think it is the view of my colleague, John McNeil, that ecology is the relationship between human populations and the geo-environment. And the key factor in the interchange is work. How humans do work to make the geoecology sustain them, and they in the process either sustain or corrode the geoecology, right? So it's an integrated system. I mean, that's my first emphasis. And yeah, I did in this, I emphasized the push half because that's what the first part of the series was about, and that's what I wanted to talk about. But it's worth emphasizing that on the other side of this, in its own way, there is a particular kind of pull in the United States. While US employers, often echoed by the government, argue they really aren't interested in workers from without. The clear reality is the demand for poor, insecure, dependent, exportable workers has been present since the early 20th century. And there's an argument to be made, and we made it in the Mexico and Mexicans in the Making the United States, that in ways we are just beginning to recognize that enslaved human beings built the US economy in the first half of the 19th century. Migrants facing constraints have been major players, contributors. They built the US economy through much of the 20th century, different times, different regions in different ways. So there is a pull factor, but it's sort of a pull factor based on the desperation created by the push factors that can then be taken advantage of in very poorly paid, very insecure employment.
So it looks like we have a question here in the Q&A from Joao, who's a student in the history department here, PhD
Hello,
student.
Joao.
He says, "Dear Professor Tutino, thanks for the wonderful presentation. If mobility characterized populations in the Americas for centuries, why do you think circum-Caribbean migration or even migration from South America to the US is mostly less relevant in numerical terms more recently?"
Boy, I can't answer everything. And the first thing I'll admit is that I know the region we're talking about here better. But the first part of the answer pertains, and I think pretty accurately, to Joao, the world he knows. Brazil is a continent to itself. And migrations within Brazil fit into this model in different and complex ways. And it's been mostly since the flows from Europe constrained in Brazil during the early 20th century, migrations from the impoverished northeast of Brazil to the industrial south have been massive and have been similar. Expulsions because of impossible lives, leading to lives facing difficult constraints in populous urban centers. There are parallels in the greater Rio de la Plata. The kinds of things we talked about here as push happened in the Andes across Bolivia, Peru, etc. They have driven large numbers of people toward Buenos Aires in similar situations. There are expulsions, and they are, I want to say, welcomed as long as they remain poor and constrained. So how will I put it ever so simply? This conversation was sort of designed to look at this particular flow, Central America, Mexico to the US. I would say to the Americas Forum and the Americas Institute, there should be a welcome conversation to make this truly Americas. We need to get everywhere.
Yes, I absolutely agree. While we wait for some more questions to come in, I wanted to ask a little bit about, so about the integration of states in this new political economy that developed with these globalizing factors, right? So there's definitely economic integration, and then with NAFTA, more of a market and a little bit more of a state integration. But how did that play out in terms of migration laws and enforcement?
Yeah, wow. And that's the tough question, because I would argue that everything I have been trying to talk about is a shared integrated system across the region. But migration laws and policies can only be explicitly for a national state. Now, yes, the US government, I will as politely as possible say, tries to influence its neighboring states to do policies that it prefers. Sometimes they get implemented as law, but policies implemented by external constraint, by external pressure, in the face of massive population pressures within, are very difficult to enforce. So, I mean, I haven't quite said it. Policy is everywhere. The border, between the US and Mexico imagines itself firm and controllable. And that's what it has never been. It has never been effectively patrolled because, I would argue in different ways at different times, human needs find a way. And they continue to find ways, not necessarily pleasant, equal, and good ways. And then you get the problem if, at least between the US and Mexico, and I'm going to set Canada aside for a moment, the policies have at least been negotiated bilaterally. And there is some history of bilateral negotiation there. And I will add, in a worldview people don't often recognize, the Mexican regime has held stable since the 1920s. Find any national regime outside of the Anglophone world that has held stable from 1920 till today. It's had changes, it's had adaptations. That too has made the US-Mexican negotiation somewhat doable, somewhat viable. Central America, in part for the very reasons, it had a history of instability before the revolutions. It had a history of desperate instability during the revolution. It has history of what I might call stabilized instability since the revolutions. And every nation has the right to its own policies, faces different pressures locally, et cetera. So coherent policies are different. I guess I'd be willing to hazard a suggestion that if the disjunction between production and access to sustenance is one enduring, nearly unsustainable contradiction of the globalizing world, the disjunction between economies, societies, population movements, cultural interactions, which are all transnational in different ways, and polities that are adamantly national and only national, is it simply an enduring disjunction. And I will quickly say, have I got a proposed solution? I do not, but we need to recognize the disjunctions.
You mentioned briefly in the talk the role that gender played in disrupting communities and how population growth and ecological change kind of shifted gender relations within Mexico. And I know that gender and patriarchy is something that you study heavily. So I
Yes.
wanted to ask about that, especially with, the last two talks that we've had over the weeks. We've talked about gendered migrations, but how do you see, gender playing into this whole dynamic?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to simplify enormous complexity, before about 1950, most rural families in Mexico and Central America lived lives defined by a basic patriarchal bargain. The male had some access to either land or employment that brought income and maize into the household. He claimed to be the provider. But in fact, what he brought in simply made women's production possible. She every day ground the maize to make tortillas to make the family. She used his earnings to buy cloth, to make clothing. She might well have done some marketing on the side too. She might have done other things for income on the side. But they lived an integrated household economy in which, ironically, external powers favored men. They were favored in access to wages and land. We don't often recognize that whereas rural land in Mexico historically was bilaterally inherited, and the revolutionary land reform only went to men. The post-revolutionary land reform locked in that male patriarchal household. Now, later inheritance broke that up some if there were no sons, but still, it's very patriarchal. What has happened in the population explosion, by means too numerous to detail, men's access to sustenance, secure sustenance, right, whether by land or wages, has dissolved to the point of vanishing. Women's ability to rely on men's provision has dissolved and has led them to take on everything. They always took care of the household, food, clothing, family, kids, and education. Was that not enough? They now have to earn income in society, in the economy. The patriarchal pact, if you will call it, is gone. And it is documented in study after study to have led to endless household conflicts. I guess there are those who imagine that the current explosion of what I will call macho violence culminating in femicide is a culmination of historic patriarchy. I would argue the exact opposite. The destruction of historic patriarchy, as unequal as it was at least sustaining and sustainable and negotiated. It has been dissolved. And if it had dissolved with gender equal access to sustainable lives, the world should be cheering. But it is dissolved with no, for majorities, sustainable access to viable family lives in rural communities or in urban barrios. And there's been this explosion of violence, and it is well documented mostly by studies by Mexican scholars in Mexico. And so it has been dissolving. And so again, it seems to me my call to not just study the need to sustain the earth, but to study the need to sustain humans needs to extend to studies and searches for ways to sustain families in an ever more complex gendered world. And again, I'm not sitting here with a solution.
Oh, looks like we just got a couple questions in the chat here. So from Martha Guerrero, could you expand on the larger significance of circular migration, both in its rise and demise within the late 20th century in relation to immigration policies? in a context of popular understanding about migrants' longstanding wish to stay in the United States?
Yeah. My emphasis would be that even wishes have changed, and wishes are often gendered. Talked about this a little bit last week. Often, the original migrants, I'm talking about in the early 20th century through the mid, they left their communities consciously saying, was it primarily a male, but often women too, as we've seen, going to, I'm going to go for a season or two. I'm going to make some money. I'm going to take it home. I'm going to buy a truck or a store. I'm going to start a family. I'm going to set myself up at home in Mexico. And for some, it worked out, and that's the way it happened. For many, they kept going back and back and back. And sooner or later, the going back lost attraction. The possibilities to remain stayed. Some of our talks to come will get into some of that transition. I am aware. We also know that over the years, the urge to return historically has been overwhelmingly male, because the patriarchal family as an ideal held longer in Mexico than in the United States. Many migrant, then Mexican-American women early on saw the lesser constraints she faced in the United States. So those debates happened within families, and many women preferred to stay, husbands preferred to go home. Then, over time, simply goals and outcomes were constrained by different border policies. So since the 86 Act, the United States has aimed to legalize limited circular migration. And we saw last week those H-1 visa programs that grew but have peaked recently. So much of the circular is now legal in parts of the US. While the coming and going, if you're not fully documented, has been constrained after constrained. We had study after study of binational families. People went back and forth, funds went back and forth, they sustained lives in connection on both sides. Now, if you are in the US and you want to go home for the holiday season, you worry that you won't get back. And what will happen? So that is a new constraint too. And the result is, it appears, and recent statistics are always not the best, it appears that except for the visaed agricultural labor, the going back and forth is less common. Families, some have gone back and consolidated, others stay here, and the going back and forth has been constrained. While for Mexico, for Central America, you may know this better than I do, Marcella, the uncertainties remain. The distances are greater, right? From the Southwest to Western Mexico is not such a big deal. From the Northeast to Guatemala or Central America is much more difficult. And undocumentation is also more difficult. So, and I guess this is my sadness. Everybody laments it. But my reading, when I step back as a macro historian, all of the uncertainties and insecurities serves to keep labor cheap. And that serves interests in both regions.
So we have another question in the chat here from Joao in a little bit different direction. So his question is, Professor, colonial and post-colonial records show us that Mexico has a long tradition of court rulings and access to courts, even by indigenous communities. How can we explain the impunity and the violence of more recent decades? Can we correlate such violence to deterioration of a once thriving judicial system?
And certainly changes in judicial systems matter a lot, and they are radically unrecognized, though they're finally getting recognized. And Joao doesn't know that I've literally been writing a piece on that topic this week. So thank you, Joao. Under Spanish rule, justice was accessible, bilingual, multilingual, and its goal was mediating. If there's a conflict, we'll find a solution everyone can live with. And justice and the regime were backed by no meaningful coercive power. The state was all but disarmed. Now, I know half the people listening say that can't be, and I'll just tell you, it was. The coming of the liberal state in 19th century Mexico actively served to end the mediating justice that aimed to negotiate settlements and provide separate multilingual justice for indigenous peoples. And it created new systems called justice, called courts. But the goal becomes to defend property and control crime. There are winners and losers. This property is yours, not yours. Some conflict happened, you're right, you're going to jail. It's a completely different kind of judicial system. And it has come with the rise of a highly militarized politics, different ways over different times. But arguably, it is the shift from mediation to enforcement justice, I will call it, that has led to so much discontent with the nature of it. And I will point out that in the system that the famous Cárdenas did consolidate in the 30s and endured through the 50s and 60s, he put in a different but equally mediating system in which he included labor, land reform recipients, et cetera, and you could get justice through your corporate organizations. And it proved stabilizing for a long time. And that mediation was taken down in the 80s and broken in the 90s. And now justice is winners and losers, backed by armed force. And in a context of social desperation, and we haven't talked about, how will one put it politely, arguably the most dynamic sector of the Mexican economy operates outside of legality and with its own armed force. That complicates this conversation beyond imagining. And I'm going to say that's a topic for another America's Forum series, but not this one.
Just to expand on that a little bit, you said that the mediation that the PRI held in terms of ruling kind of broke in the 1990s.
Broken. It wasn't
broken. Can you talk about the role of the Zapatista uprising in terms of this?
Yeah. The Zapatista uprising marked two pivotal things. It marked opposition to NAFTA in a particular both political community and rural regions. But it also marked the fact that they call themselves Zapatistas suggests they hoped to replicate Zapata, who raised rural communities and, though defeated in the field, forced the Mexican government to adapt to them with the most massive land reform ever done in Latin America, period. They hoped for something similar. They lasted 2 weeks in the field and came to negotiations in which they were politically stymied, were able to keep some local regions, but shall we say politely, did not gain anything like what the original Zapatistas gained in a transition of Mexico. Ironically, however, I will say that that may have been the last mediation of the Priista state. I always look at the Zapatista rising in the context because it was the last Central American uprising of the 80s and 90s. And in Guatemala and El Salvador, the reaction was armed destruction. We will come in and destroy you. The Mexican regime, as a regime, mediated by deeply, the left-leaning Bishop of Chiapas, and I have to advertise, his legal advisor was then a doctoral student at Georgetown in the room throughout. Had to take a leave from my class to go mediate the conflict, then came home with pictures. So I didn't get to be there, but I got to hear about it. They mediated that solution. They did not, not to say there was no violence and no repression. Compared to El Salvador and Guatemala, this was a mediated solution. In some ways, a few of you have read 18th century indigenous uprisings. They'd come in, shoot a few rounds, wound, maybe kill a few people, and then take it to court and find a mediated solution. You could argue that that happened on a regional scale in the Zapatista rising. And they pacified it and they dragged it out and they forced it to just dissolve really in the long run. So I would argue that that may have been the last of the mediated conflicts. Now, as everything has turned to either urban violence or the drug wars, not a lot of mediation going on. Right, wrong, will shoot you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Professor Tutino, for your talk and all of your insights with the questions here. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that our fourth talk for the Crossing the Border series will be taking place on February 28th. So not next week, but the following Monday. And that will be with Ruben Hernandez Leon from UCLA. And it's titled Urban Origin Migration, Industrial Monterrey in the US-Mexico Migratory System. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat here for registration for anyone interested. There you go.
And I will thank Marcella and all of you too for a wonderful session. Thank you all.